everybody. Jason Haas here with the semi-weekly Instagram Live broadcast from Tablas Creek. I am super excited for my guest this week. It's Evan Goldstein, Master Sommelier, author, teacher, entrepreneur, really one of the most dynamic guys in the world of wine. So I'm super looking forward to talking to Evan. But while we are waiting for people to join, as I always do, I am going to show you a few pictures with what things look like at the vineyard right now. So, a good overview. This is looking from the northernmost edge of the property, looking south. So up along south-facing hill, this is a head train Tanat block in the foreground. And then as you get further up, you get into some of our north-facing slope whites like Marsan and Viognier up at the top of the hill. You can see it is exceptionally green. It is still, it doesn't feel like it's been dry for the last 2 months, but it's been dry for the last 2 months. We, at this point, are not sure how much more rain we're going to get at all. But, so a couple more pictures. We are starting to clean things up under the vine rows. You can see on the left there, this is a Marsan block. We're starting to get the cover crop, get it cultivated underneath the vine rows, and just get things starting to get ready for spring. We're also taking advantage of the fact that it's been chilly and things are still, we don't have bud break yet, to get our sheep a third pass through most of the vineyard. This is them in a Mourvedre block at the southern end of the property. I mentioned that it's been cold. This is a frosty morning photo. It is really good that it's been frosty because it's been so sunny and so dry that if it hadn't been cold at night, we would almost certainly have seen bud break at this point. And that's scary because we could have frosts here all the way until really the beginning of May. So keeping things dormant as far into March and hopefully maybe even into April as we can is a bit of a hedge against the damage that we might get from a frost. Okay, a couple more pictures before I invite Evan to join me. What are we working on in the cellar? Well, we've been bottling. We bottled 4 new wines last week. Some of the kind of lighter bodied, fresher reds from 2020. So Grenache, Cunois, Sanso, and our Côte Tablas. We're excited. We've been short on wine for a long time. This is the beginning of the cavalry arriving. We have also been getting ready to do a second set of boxes for our Patelin Rosé. Those of you who follow us on social media will realize that we released our first ever 3-liter boxes of rosé a couple weeks ago and sold out in 4 hours, which is great and also not what we were expecting. I'm sorry. I apologize to everybody who got shut out on it. We're making another batch next week, and if you got shut out, look for an email. Look for an email soon. And then finally, we have been trying to make sure that the barrels that we have that are just almost fermented, almost done, but not quite done, get a little extra nudge. So we've been bringing them out into the sun each day, and then bringing them back in at night. So these are Roussanne and Picpoul and Claret Blanche barrels that are getting to spend the noon times outside. We're going to get started on blending week after next. So that's the next big thing, which is in our calendar. And then finally, one last picture, just to give you a sense of what else is going on in this landscape here. This is a picture that I took and really love. This is looking up into one of the oak trees with newly sprouted oak leaves, deep blue sky. It's so beautiful right now. I love that it's still green, still crisp, but we know spring is on its way. Okay, stop sharing. I'm going to invite Evan to join me, and there we are. His request right there. Can't wait for this conversation. Hey, how are you,
Hey,
Evan?
I am good. I'm happy I'm here. I had some connectivity issues this morning, but I'm glad they are all resolved, and I'm delighted to be here. And I was looking at your pictures as you were talking about coaxing your red wine barrels, or your barrels, I should say, out into the sun, and I was reminded of some time down in the Roussillon, when where that's a very normal practice of bringing wines out there and allowing them to ambiently do that. And I was thinking it's probably as close, at least for the foreseeable future, as I'm going to get to that part of the world. So thank you for bringing me virtually.
My pleasure. Yeah, this is, I mean, we're always into trying to figure out natural ways to encourage the processes that we want. And that's true in the stuff that we do in the vineyard. It's true with stuff that we do in the cellar. And like rather than heat up an entire cellar for barrels that don't necessarily need it, let's individually take the barrels that need that last little push, stick them outside in the sun for a few hours and see if that does the trick.
Absolutely. Nobody needs to create an estufa gem if they don't have to.
Cool. Okay, so Evan, I gave everybody a very quick introduction into a little bit of your background when I first started. I think before I saw you join on. Mm-hmm. So, Master Sommelier, entrepreneur, writer. You grew up sort of in the world of food and wine. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel very fortunate and blessed to have grown up at a time in a household where, for most people, wine was probably not part of what they did. Obviously, it was for you and it was for me. But we had wine at table. My parents had a cellar. And so wine was sort of brought into my life early on. We were very fortunate in that our household was, what's the best way? Welcoming of that. So we had our water colored when we were little. When I was a teenager, statute of limitations is over, and my grades were reasonably good. I was allowed to have a glass of wine at dinner, and clearly as I got older, a little bit more so. And it was very much a natural part of my life, and I feel sort of fortunate in that way that one, wine was part of my table the way it was for so many places in the world where it sits on the table like salt, pepper, olive oil, whatever condiments are there. And growing up in a household with a mother who is, of course, a celebrated chef, we ate well as drinking well. So I've had good wine and good food in my blood since as long as I can remember. And whereas most people probably had to struggle to have good wine and food experiences when they were young, for me it was the complete opposite. The only time we would ever get fast food, for example, was when my parents went on vacation and we could coax the babysitter into dragging us to Jack in the Box.
Awesome. Yeah, that's some real familiar themes to my own growing up. So did you, like, as this was happening, did you think that you were going to make a career out of food and wine? Was that always in your idea, or is that something that you came to later?
No, it's actually something I came to semi later. My original quote unquote dream when I was a young Todd was to be a rock and roll drummer. And in fact, I played when I was younger. We gigged when I was a high schooler and all of that. But we made enough money to go out and enjoy ourselves on the other days of the week. And I realized really quickly, especially having worked for a record company for a couple summers in a row, that there was no future there. And I wanted to do something that was, that was artistic, that was creative, and it gave you that sort of same sense of immediate satisfaction that playing music does when you get applause or people holding up their, lighters back in the day or whatever, and showing you that. And food had always been something that was interesting to me. Restaurants were something I loved. The open line kitchen was starting to literally open up at the time when I was thinking about this. And that seemed to be an interesting pathway because food, of course, and cooking was artistic. Being a part of an open line was appropriate for customers as well as your staff to come over and let you know right on the spot there. So I decided to go into food, following in the footsteps of my mom, but realized several years later that if I was going to do food for the rest of my life, that I would be forever known as Joyce Goldstein's kid. And that's something I didn't want to do. And I'm sure you probably have your own stories about working with a parent who is an icon in their industry and trying to find their own niche. So I had always enjoyed wine. When I was working in Europe, and then subsequently opening up the Auberge du Soleil in Napa with Masa Kobayashi, then moving down to Chez Panisse before we opened up Square One, I was always rebuffed when wanting to do anything that assisted on the wine program, although I was certainly interested in it. And then ultimately when we opened up Square One, I used that as a segue, if you will, to sort of leave the kitchen, go onto the floor, deal with the wine. My mother was, in fact, relieved because she said, both of us can't be in the kitchen as well. And you talk more than I do, and you've always wanted to do wine. So it worked out very serendipitously. But no, to answer your basic question, was food and wine something that I had always thought I was going to do in my life? Probably not as a profession.
So was it at that stage that you started really diving into the study of wine? Because I mean, when you were fairly early on the Master Sommelier track, and I think you were the youngest Master Somm ever at the time when you got your
Yeah,
pin.
at the time, I was a whopping 26 years old, and passed it in 1987. I believe I was number 7 or 8, depending on if I won a Indian arm wrestling match with Nunzio Alioto at the time. We both passed in London at the same time. Prior to that, and it's interesting how the world changes literally the day after you pass your MS. Certainly back then, when there were so few of us as opposed to the time prior. I'd been studying, obviously, as we were working up to opening up the restaurant. We had essentially 2 years of pre-opening, of which I had to learn what, the wholesale network was all about, learn about where I could find the wines, et cetera, as well as establish sort of a point of view. And it was really the point of view that sort of led me on my journey of studies. At the time, restaurants in the Bay Area, specifically San Francisco, were essentially defined by the Holy Trinity. And the Holy Trinity at that time was classified Bordeaux, Peace Porter, Goldstropchen, or whatever Riesling was there, and maybe a Chianti or two if you could find it, or God forbid, a Puy Fuissé or a Vouvray or something like that. But there was no real ambition in the programs at a much deeper level. This literally coincided with the time that, number one, I was leaving, obviously, my own experience at Chez Panisse, where people like, Kermit Lynch were on the scene, and bringing small estate bottled French and Italian wines into the houses of America when people weren't really thinking about it, as well as the sort of surge, the upswell in the water, the wave, if you will, of the first California boutique wine. So while I was familiar with that, personally at Chez Panisse and, being in Napa Valley for a while, I had never really found a restaurant that took as deep a stand as I felt we should, knowing that this was part of our heritage. It was part of where we wanted to go. And it was, in fact, a differentiating characteristic at the time. So I literally knocked on the doors of the McRae's at Stony Hill, Dave Raffinelli, Joe Swan, may he rest in peace, and a number of other wineries, Al Bronstein, may he rest in peace, to get their wines on a wine list when they had never sold to a restaurant prior to that. And I can proudly say that we opened up the door of Square One on May 14th, 1984, with a number of those wines and many others, accompanying a point of view that was at once this sort of Mediterranean stand that I had learned at Chez Panisse, my own personal studies into learning about, well, we do Portuguese food and Spanish food, we should have those wines as well. And that sort of really helped drive the areas of interest, and hence my initial area of study, which then collectively led to a body of work that made me stupid enough to try and take the MS exam back in March of '87.
And I think you sort of brush up against an interesting thing that I think maybe the restaurants of the Bay Area and the wine lists of the Bay Area are still struggling with, or at least still figuring out what the right way is to address, which is that so much of this kind of farm to table movement that was focusing on local, seasonal, regional produce had wine lists that were all coming from 5,000 miles away.
Yeah.
And with this incredible proliferation of wineries and wine regions going on sort of in the backyard of the Bay Area, and it sounds like you recognized that maybe before most other people did.
Yeah, we were very much at the tip of the spear, and coming from, obviously, a Chez Panissian, Locavorian focal point there. Although the food style was definitively more Mediterranean, frankly French and Italian, more than it was anything. Certainly focusing in on ingredients and farmers and local production of meats and growing. We were dealing with Hog Island Oyster Farm before anybody even knew what it was very much part of the direction we were going. And it seemed very natural to us that whether it was wine, for sure. But even things like, the first spirits, when your group started St. George long before there was anybody distilling here, or, the first beers that were coming out as crafted, because there wasn't much of it. Sierra Nevada was craft. Back then, we felt very strongly about doing that. Obviously, it seems to be relatively commonplace and a sort of like, so what, these days. But at the time, it was very, very avant-garde and something we felt very strongly about, even though our palate of food was not necessarily per se California, as the California cuisine
Right.
movement was literally at its beginnings at that point in time. Nevertheless, we did recognize the importance of having products that were from your own backyard, literally from a food standpoint, a produce standpoint, being supported strongly by the wines that grew up with them.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Again, I think that's the kind of thing that people take for granted now, that and maybe don't realize that really wasn't that long ago where this was cutting edge.
Yeah, no, it doesn't seem like that. And again, it is sort of understood. It's like telling people, you tell a joke these days and reference something like, I don't know, Gilligan's Island, and nobody knows what you're talking about. But back then, it was a big show and a big deal. And I think that, when people, start thinking about it, they realize that it wasn't always there. And that there were a number of us who helped shepherd that in and brought what is sort of an understood norm today, sort of almost a de rigueur, to enter your program as something that was novel.
Cool. Okay, so talk a little bit about the beginnings of your work writing about wine and writing about pairings particularly.
Yeah, so one of the things that sort of was an advent of what we did, a tangent, if you will, was when we had Square One, we had a space down at the corner of Pacific and Front Streets in San Francisco, in the heart of the financial district, around the area that people called MacArthur Park, simply because MacArthur Park restaurant was there, but it was actually Sidney Walton Square. And we had the restaurant. The restaurant was doing well. We took over the space next door and opened up a very short-lived, but nevertheless very successful predecessor to artisanal pizzas, if you will, in a place called Cafe Quadro. The first probably popular spinoff of that was California Pizza Kitchen, if you can imagine that. But we were so far ahead of our time, and pizza wasn't the deal that it is today, that we ended up closing the restaurant, using the ovens for bread baking and pastry, which was great for us. But we had this big space. So we turned the space into a private room, which was great. We were able to use it for everything from rehearsal dinners to whatever. But I started teaching food and wine classes out of that because I figured I had it. We had an interest. Square One was a wine destination restaurant, and we tried them, and they became wildly popular. So we would teach, different wine topics, beer and food, spirits, food and wine matching, or whatever. And I had the luxury of a great chef to work with in putting these programs together. And we did them ostensibly at the beginning as a way to sort of get people, as they were leaving work in the neighborhood, have them have a wine tasting and food pairing class with us, and then go have dinner right afterwards and literally walk into the restaurant. It was a great incremental business thing. Little did I know that there was so much interest in this that these became wildly popular. I was probably teaching wine and food or wine classes with food accompaniments probably 40 weeks a year back in the mid 80s. And that became sort of the heart. So essentially, when I started writing about it and did my first books, Perfect Pairings, and then subsequently Daring Pairings, a lot of it was simply based. Perfect Pairings was literally written at 30,000 feet on an airplane, and before my kids' soccer practices, essentially just putting into paper or text these days what I was doing with basic things. And it took off. Subsequently, Daring Pairings took off as sort of the appropriate sequel so that Toy Story 2 could be as good as Toy Story. And then subsequently, when my publisher, University of California at the time, said, we've got to do something third, I really didn't feel like I had anything else to say in the world of wine and food. That's like putting out the third episode of the movie that should never have been made. But I did want to do something referential. I'd never written a reference book before. And at the time, nobody had really touched hard on South America as a continent. So I wrote Wines of South America, your essential guide, and literally was the first person to cover all 10 wine producing nations on that continent at a deeper level than had been done prior.
Cool. So talk a little bit about the different things that you're working on now. I mean, between what you're doing with Full Circle Wine Solutions, the things you're doing with Master of the World, your ongoing work kind of writing and
Mhm.
speaking? Like what is your like weekly, monthly world look like at the moment?
Oh, it's very scattered and crazy, but it's all really busy. So the two core businesses, as you touched on, are rather Full Circle Wine Solutions, which is literally celebrating its 14th anniversary this year, and it's a full service agency that basically deals with trade associations, which is to say, we work with the California Wine Institute, we work with Anterron in the Rhone Valley, we work with Wines of Brazil, Oregon Wine Board, etc. And we essentially are the wall between them having messaging of things they want to get out and getting in touch with customers, trade primarily, but also consumers. And that's been a very healthy business, and it's grown over time. We're doing the first ever iteration of Spain's Great Match. They're a big wine and food pairing event that they do annually down in Orlando in a couple of weeks. We have big events coming up with a number of other areas, and yeah, Portugal and California, we're working on Capstone. Master the World is a program that I developed a couple of years ago. It actually took 6 years to come up with the idea, although everyone seems to think we came up with it in time for the pandemic. But it's essentially a subscription kit of 6 wines that arrive to a person who subscribes blind every month. And it really gives them an opportunity with an online accompanying tool to learn, discern, grow their palates, etc. And it's been very successful to the point where a number of both companies, regions, we'll do them for different regions of the world. We have a tri-set of Chilean Sauvignon Blancs going out with VinePair in the not too distant future. And we just did a thing for the New York Grape Foundation, and we do stuff for Court of Master Sommeliers, et cetera. But where you and I have intersected here is a handful of wineries, yourselves and Ridge most notably, have come in and started working with us on a regular basis as a very novel, and I tip my beret to you, way of interacting with your consumers and your direct-to-consumer programming or your distributors or whoever, in terms of letting them know what's coming down the pipeline, showing them new releases, and people can come in and participate literally, virtually trying the same wines at the same time without you having to send out a full bottle, which is cost prohibitive and crazy. And then to be able to say, God, I like that, Jason, I'd like to buy a case of this or a case of that subsequently. So it's been on fire. We have been growing crazily. Labor is probably our biggest issue, as long as managing supply chain is. I know you probably are addressing the same things in grape and glasses and bottles and cardboard and everything.
And cardboard and all of it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm
so
writing a little bit. I was just going to say, just to finish up the writing, I have no books in my foreseeable future because I'm really busy with my 2 children, but I have been repicking up a little bit of stuff here and there. I'm penning a few more articles for Wine Review in Korea, which an art organization I've been working with for 10 years, and a couple of other small projects.
Cool. And yeah, just to tie that up in a bow for people.
Ooh, I lost your audio.
Together. Do you hear me now?
Now I hear you. Yeah.
Okay. So just to tie everything together for the people who weren't aware of it, we've been doing for the last 3 wine club shipments the opportunity for wine club members who can't make it here for an in-person tasting party to buy these kits that we've done with Master of the World, where they get a little 187 milliliter vial of each of the 6 wines in the shipment, and then Neil, who's our winemaker, and I will host a Facebook Live and YouTube Live tasting that people can interact with us, try the wines. And again, it's not like they have to open 6 full bottles. It's not like we have to ship 6 full bottles. They have to buy 6 full bottles, get a chance to try the stuff. It's so cool. And it was one of the things that I know when we were first figuring out new ways of doing things during the pandemic. Like, our thought was, man, wouldn't it be nice if somebody actually was able to rebottle these wines into smaller packages and have good quality control? And like, we didn't have to invent all of this. And we did a little digging, and we're like, oh, somebody is. So I can understand why people who were unaware of this before the pandemic discovered it and thought that it was a pandemic invention, because it was so perfectly timed for what we needed.
Well, and you know what I think is interesting is we exit the pandemic and hopefully enter a more endemic reality of things, is that a lot of these things are going to be part of people's DNA. You know, there's going to be these ongoing events. There's going to be times when winemakers in other parts of the world don't necessarily have to jump on a plane and go visit to do all that. They can do their tour virtually by shipping wines in smaller programmings. And conferences can be done this way. So we sort of see it as, you know, not only are more and more people engaging and comfortable with virtual, but it makes a lot of sense as a supplement
Yeah.
as we get back to normal to other processes. And we have not seen anything slow down. And even when a lot of programs that we support have gone back to in-person stuff, the online hasn't slowed down at all. So it's wonderful that we're just bringing more tools to the table as all of us strive to get more directly and have more personal, emotional connection with those people that love us and love our wines.
I could not agree more. I mean, one of the big lessons that we took home from that first year of the pandemic is that traditional wine marketing requires the customer, whether that be an actual consumer or whether that's a retail buyer or a restaurateur, requires that customer to come to where the winery person is. And whether that's a literal visit to the winery or whether that's come to a trade show where you're pouring your wines or come to a wine dinner where you're talking about your wines, it's required the customer to come to you. And the things that we learned to do when obviously you couldn't be in the same places as customers most of the time, bring the wine to wherever the customer is on their schedule and with flexibility.
Absolutely.
And we figured that, I mean, we have a lot of people who come to see us every year, but really what percentage of our current or potential customers can make a visit to Tablas Creek? It's tiny. And if we can find ways to get to the ones who can't make a visit, it opens up so many opportunities.
Well, and I also concur because, you know, I was chatting with people, you know, even in my own Court of Master Sommelier's world, you know, the people they can't necessarily make the timing of a live course, so they're going to an online course, or even if they could make the timing of a real course, you know, they don't want to spend the money to fly out there, put themselves up in a hotel, et cetera. So if there are ways of literally meeting with people and chatting with people and engaging with them in the confines of their own home or with their friends at a place that they want with those wines at the same time, it's incredibly beneficial. And to your point, you know, yes, you know, more and more so these days, the mountain needs to go to Mohammed. Right, we can't be asking people to make things when they have so much choice there, and I think they really appreciate it. I think they like it, and as I said before, I think these kinds of things are here to stay.
Yeah, and I think they complement the in-person things that we are now back to able to do. They're not. It's not an either-or thing. They can
Absolutely.
appeal to different audiences.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so um, I'm curious. Do you have a wine that was for you like a memorable first wine experience?
Oh, I do, and I'm going to make people cringe here. You know, obviously, you asked this question to your average individual. I'm going to throw the same question back at you when we're done on this one. But your average person says, "Oh yeah, I had this like Robert Mondavi red in a Magnum, and it changed my life." Or I had a bottle of Annie Greensprings or Matus Rosé, and oh my God, I had all these things because we had wine in the house. I don't want to say I was numb to it, but you know, it's like I needed a wine that would do it. So I remember when I was about 13 or 14 years old, we had Thanksgiving dinner, and my father my mother rather pulled out of the cellar a bottle of 1943 Domaine de la Romane Conti La Tâche. And I remember trying that wine, you know, and of course, I would still today have that wine and went, oh my God. And I don't mean to sound like a snob or a snoot, but you asked, and indeed that was the wine, and it actually sits back here. You probably can't see it from there. Hang on, I'll grab it. But literally, you know, I keep it, you know, along with my dead Richebourg. Sorry, not Latache. I apologize, but I keep it with my dead soldiers because it was literally that impactful. So it sounds a bit snooty, it sounds a bit snobby, but it really did shake me and make me realize, oh my God, you know, because also the fact that it was made during the war, all these other things. So I want to ask that question of you, coming from a wine family. What was the bottle of wine that did it for you?
So the first one, like as I'm sure happened with you, my parents spent lots of time around the dinner table, kind of talking about the wines that they were drinking, and like we would taste the wines, and I remember for big stretches of this thinking like I will never be able to do that. Like I can they're talking about tasting this and that and identifying this particular year, this particular region, this particular producer, and I'm like that's way beyond the pale of anything that I could imagine. But the wine that for me was the one where the first time I was like, I taste those things that they're describing, and like I get this was a Domaine Weinbach Gewürztraminer, Alsatian Gewürztraminer, and I think Gewürz is, I mean, it's so exuberant and outgoing, and it tastes like tastes like rose petals. It totally does taste like rose petals. Like it's got it tastes like lychee. It has a little bit of sweetness, and for me at a similar age, 13 or 14. I was like, I taste these things that they're describing. Like this feels possible.
Yeah.
So that was for me the one.
Yeah, and I just think that, when you have that aha moment, and it's going to vary based on who you are, where you are, what you're doing, just having that aha moment and making you realize, oh my gosh, either I can do this, or this is more amazing than I thought it was, or it's more than just a glass of something to have on the table, is such a killer thing, because literally, how much art of which wine is clearly art can you actually ingest into you and bring into you and have reactions and discuss with people and travel and all that. I think it's an amazing thing.
So, updating that, is there something that you've had recently that really blew your mind?
Oh gosh, I was pulling bottles the other day, so I haven't actually. I've been tasting a lot of wines from Master of the World, but the wine that actually made me step back and remember, had a deja vu moment, was I had some friends that were coming in from out of town, and they were. They're wine people of serious sorts, and I wanted to bring them something that if you're here from out of the country, you're coming to North America, that you never tried before, what to do. And this person knows California reasonably well. So I was venturing around, and I actually sort of figured I was going to stretch it. And I pulled a bottle of 2017 Mogor Badan, which is from the Valle de Guadalupe in Baja, California. And it's a Bordeaux blend made by a woman, Madame Bourdain, who's been in the business from her family moving over there years ago. And it was as close to Bordeaux as you could possibly ever imagine being in Mexico. And it was stunning. So I bought a bottle of this and another interesting white she made and brought it home. And as I was going through the cellar, I said, we've got to pull this up as an option. So I brought it up as an option and put it there alongside a couple of things. And unfortunately, she picked a bunch of Washington wines, so I didn't get to try that. But I just remembered that as having been just a stunning and unexpected bottle that I'm actually going to probably enjoy in the next week.
Awesome. Cool. Okay. So one last question, because I can't believe that it has already been a half an hour, but it has already
Amazing.
been a half an hour. I could do this all afternoon.
Ditto.
Sorry. We got a request saying,
yeah.
Please say the wine name again. So.
Oh, Mogor, Mogor Badan, Badan. And it's a small producer. It's not exported out of the country, to the best of my knowledge, out of Baja Guadalupe. And they have a restaurant, I believe it's called Deckman's, which is one of the best restaurants in that area as well, too. And you can drink all of their wines there, along with many other wineries in the Guadalupe Valley. But she is fabulous, and the wines are great.
Awesome. Cool. Okay. So, is there a trend or a region or an idea in the world of wine that you think is going to become important, or is starting to become important, that people should be paying more attention to?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that, it would be very trite to just sort of say up and coming regions like Jura, because, everyone's discovered Jura now, although we all know it. But I would say just this ongoing, the two things that sort of strike me as being nerves with people right now are, number one, this whole holistic area of what we call orange wines, natural wines, etc. Now, when I say this, I mean wines that play in that sandbox. But, if I want to drink cider, I will order cider. So they've got to be well-made examples of them. But I think there's a lot of there, and people certainly are connecting to them. So I would say ongoing discovery of what that category is. Although personally, I will say, frankly, in front of all your Instagram folks here, that it's not my favorite category. But I do think this ongoing discovery of new places and areas that I was really excited about up until recently, although I'm afraid that much of it is going to be moved, sideways a little bit, is Central Europe. I've been really excited about what's going on in Slovenia and Slovakia, the Czech Republic, et cetera, et cetera. And with everything going on in that part of the world, and them focusing probably more on, frankly, refugees from Ukraine and stuff, then I think that's going to slow to a halt. I had some wonderful Moldovan wines recently that I thought were good, and was in Prague just a few years ago, and was really blown away by a lot of the varieties being interpreted there by smaller producers that were great. But I think we're going to have to put that on hold. But just ongoing discovery. Mexico would be another place. Canada would be another place. I'm actually going up to judge the national Canadian wine competition. 400 and something Canadian wine per, craziness in June.
Cool. Yeah, I wish that more of the wines from Mexico and from Canada were available in the United States. I mean, they're both markets that have relatively small domestic production and are largely importers of wine. And so, like any domestic production, or most of the domestic production that's made there, it gets snapped up within the country, and we just don't get to see it very much. So I'm jealous of you getting to go and explore those regions on the ground, because I think that's probably the only way to get a good kind of big picture view of what's going on there.
Yeah, no, there's a little bit of BC wine that makes it here into California. I believe there's a company called VJ Imports, actually out of Palo Alto, that brings in a handful. I know it for a project I worked with them on. Mexico's starting slowly but surely. But yeah, to your point, the good wines are made in small production and they're snapped up locally. So best to go and experience it in person if you can.
Cool. Okay, so for people who want to learn more about the things that you work on, or what you're doing, what's the best way for them to follow you, connect with you?
Yeah, I would say in this day, probably the best public interface I have these days is through Master the World. So people go to literally Google it, Master the World, it'll pop up. But MTW for Master the World Wines, MTWWINES.com. That'll bring you up to the world with everything that's going on with Master the World. In fact, I think maybe people can find some of your kits there for your spring release. But also there's a way to, if they want to get in touch with me personally, they can shoot me an email and stuff like that. But yeah, it's cool. It's amazing. We're so fortunate in these times to be doing things we love, Jason, and having a good time doing it. Thank you so much for having me today and chatting with you. And literally, I could spend all afternoon talking with you. We share so many points of commonality and loves of wine and stuff like that. And I look forward to hopefully seeing you down south at some point later this year.
Excellent. I look forward to it. Cool. Well, thank you, Evan Goldstein, for joining me for the conversation today. Thank you, Tablas Creek viewers, for tuning in. I'll be back in 2 weeks. I have Christy Dufault, a Assam and wine educator, who will be my guest. She and her husband, Jordan, have recently moved from the Bay Area to the Hudson Valley of New York, and are exploring a different part of the world of wine. So join me in 2 weeks for my conversation with Christy. Meanwhile, Evan, thank you again. Viewers, thank you again. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Bye, everyone.